Hey everyone, I'm Bradley and welcome to Zlangle. Hellboy is one of my favorite comic book characters ever, and the Hellboy Mignolaverse that the brilliant writer and artist Mike Mignola created and nurtured over the last 25 years is one of the most spellbinding achievements in all of comics. Being able to tell small, personal stories while all of the comics fitting into one giant intertwining narrative universe made up of dozens of different titles spanning decades of chronology, and possibly, most importantly, unlike Marvel or DC, it is internally consistent and actually adheres to the passage of time and human aging. But other than that, while being artful and thoughtful, it is also fortunately pretty popular, through both the comics and the previous movies. But when they couldn't find a way to make a third film in the original series by Del Toro, they decided to reboot the franchise and at least try to make it closer to the comics. And while they did hit a lot of the story beats and characters and visuals from the comics, I do think they missed most of the point of what the comics were and how the stories were told. Okay, so at this point, we've had 3 adaptations of Hellboy so far, and 2 have been really good, but even those weren't super faithful to what Mike Mignola has accomplished on the page. So even though it probably won't happen at this point, I do think that a great, faithful adaptation can be done. But let's talk about Hellboy 2019. Hellboy seemed to have a lot of trouble in production, but since those are reports and I wasn't there, I won't talk too much about what and who. But what I do know is that a lot of the fans weren't happy with the outlook of this film from the very beginning. First, we have the Del Toro fans, who seemed upset that they were rebooting instead of continuing the story. And we also had the comic book fans, who were perhaps a bit perplexed about the hard R rating, and this trailer. And while I was hoping that the film wouldn't turn out like that, and it kind of didn't, even though it relied on a weird, out-of-place soundtrack throughout, it still definitely didn't capture the spirit of either the original pulpy action feel or the later gothic, paranormal atmosphere that the artwork and storytelling presented. But like I said, you can still have a good Hellboy movie without being all too faithful. And the majority of any film audience isn't going to be the hardcore fans anyway. So why did Hellboy fail at both the box office and with the critics so miserably? Well, I obviously am not an average moviegoer, at least with this property and franchise. So it's a bit hard to say exactly how a normal person experiences this movie. But I can see how this film might seem very convoluted, confusing, slightly nonsensical, and at times pointless. But to someone like me, imagine if you've seen all or most of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, if someone made a 2-hour compilation of any of the great moments and stories from the MCU, but treated it as if it was a complete film itself. If you were already a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then you would recognize the scenes and characters and follow along with that video, but to someone who never saw a Marvel movie, it would seem like an absolute mess. That's how I see this movie. Hellboy was like a fun compilation of a lot of the comic book stories, but doesn't quite stand alone on its own. Some of the great comics it took inspiration from and or adapted included The Corpse, The Wild Hunt, a bit of Darkness Calls and Storm of the Fury, a sprinkle of Lobster Johnson, obviously some Seed of Destruction, a dash of The Chained Coffin, b.p.r.d, along with Bandemio of course, and a few Hellboy in Mexico allusions, just for good measure. All within one movie. So I honestly did get a kick out of this Hellboy film, especially after hearing it was so bad before I saw it. But you know what, I had fun with it, being such a huge Hellboy fan. But the biggest problem is, no one else did. And even more than that, most people didn't even go to check it out when it was in theaters. Now, superhero movies that are critically despised and absolute box office bombs are nothing new. But do you notice something similar about all of these? Yeah, that's right. For the most part, they all come back in different variations and in different movies eventually at some point later on. Because these are big superhero movies by Marvel and DC, and they aren't about to let some box office failings and bad reviews get in the way of making more of them, knowing that there are an almost unlimited amount of fans out there waiting for every comic book movie no matter what it is. Me. The problem with Hellboy is that I don't know if we'll ever see him in live action again, at least not in the next 15 to 20 years. It already took over 10 years to reboot the series that everyone loved and actually, made a profit. What about the movie that lost tons of money for the studio and everyone hated? No studio was going to look at Hellboy and consider it a viable investment for a long time to come, especially since the Mignolaverse has been winding down in the comics for a while now, and has a fraction of the comics being published now than it did at its peak a few years ago. So that really is the tragedy of Hellboy. Not that it wasn't the best movie, or that it bombed at the box office, or even the fact that people not familiar with the comics might think that this
Stop being a whiny little shit.
is what Hellboy is. It's not. But no, the true tragedy of this film, and the consequences of its results, is that we will most likely not see Hellboy in a big budget feature film again in my lifetime. Even when they have one of the most detailed, sophisticated, long-running, cohesive, mind-blowingly creative and interesting universes as the bottomless well of source material in history. And like I said earlier, with the comics universe pretty much wrapping up its story, the hunger and demand for it by an audience will never be on the same level again. Not only did this film unfortunately fail, they most likely failed for the last time. Nuff said, and Excelsior.